Perfect. Let me share my screen and we will get started. Okay. Perfect. Alrighty, here we go. So I am Carmen Behofen. I'm the program coordinator here for UC. We're so excited that you all are able to join us this evening for the Great Salty Phenomenon, investigating Great Salt Lake's decline through 3D science. So really quickly, a little bit about UC. UC's mission is to promote excellence in environmental education and community engagement to connect all Utahns to their natural world. We are the NAAEE affiliate, and we also have a lot of exciting events and things coming up that we hope that you will join us for past this event as well, including October webinars, our conference, and a lot more fun stuff coming up for this new year as well. And then we'll hand it back over to Katie and Kristen, and we are all set for you guys.
Thanks, Carmen, and thanks to all you wonderful people at the Utah Society for Environmental Education. We're really excited to be part of this webinar series, and we just love all the wonderful work that you do for our community. So thank you for having us. My name is Katie Newburn. I'm the Education and Outreach Director for Friends of Great Salt Lake.
I am Kristen Bonner, and I teach K-6 lab science at Indian Hills Elementary in Salt Lake.
And Kristen is also a member of our board of directors at Friends of Great Salt Lake and has been a huge part of our education programs over the years. So we're really grateful to have her expertise as part of our team. So as a little bit of an introduction to Friends of Great Salt Lake, Friends of Great Salt Lake is a nonprofit membership-based organization founded in 1994 with the mission to preserve and protect the Great Salt Lake ecosystem through education, research, advocacy, and the arts. So we provide programs within each of those focus areas, including our Lakeside Learning Field Trip program, which serves fourth grade classes, and an assortment of education resources adapted from that program. We have self-guided field trips for Antelope Island State Park and Great Salt Lake State Park. We have instructions and videos for hands-on science activities. And we have all of the resources, including the slides and some other tools related to this presentation available on our website at the link that I shared in the chat, which hopefully is still visible. So that's where all of this information will be if you want to refer back to it later on. And before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of why this is important. Science learning is such a valuable opportunity for students to better understand the ecosystems that they're a part of by observing, questioning, and investigating the natural phenomena around them. That really is science, and that is environmental education. And it's essential to the future and the resiliency of our communities as we continue to face climate change and environmental issues going on around us. That really is the meaning to me of environmental literacy, is an understanding of the ecosystems we're a part of and our relationship to them. In many ways, the story of Great Salt Lake is a kind of a cautionary tale about environmental illiteracy. Our community, across decades of ignorance and neglect, has brought Great Salt Lake to the brink of an environmental disaster in our own backyards. And our students will have to face this issue and many other environmental issues in their lifetimes. So as future decision makers, it's really imperative that they have a strong understanding of the ecosystems around them. And if you are a person who lives in northern Utah, anywhere in the area that's shown on this map, that means it's essential for you to understand Great Salt Lake. So this is a map of the Great Salt Lake watershed, and today we'll be learning about how this area is all connected to Great Salt Lake's ecosystem. And an ecosystem is the living things and the non-living factors and the interactions that occur between them in a given area.
So today we will analyze and interpret data to construct an explanation about the cause of the changing water level of Great Salt Lake. To do this, we're going to use phenomenon-based 3D science instruction, 3-dimension science instruction. So just so we're all on the same page, a phenomenon is something that we can observe, and it often makes us wonder, makes us ask a question. And the 3 dimensions of science are based on a framework for K-12 science education. The Utah seed standards are also based on this research document. And there are 3 dimensions of science instruction. There are disciplinary core ideas, the DCIs. There's science and engineering processes, the SEPs, and the cross-cutting concepts. So when we wrote the goal of this program, the analyze, interpret data, we followed the same format the Utah seed standards did. So the DCI are the topics that scientists study, and this is unbolded in the core and not underlined. In this case, we're looking at life sciences and ecosystems. For our science and engineering processes, these are the actions that scientists take, and these are bolded. So we are analyzing and interpreting data today. We are going to be looking at a lot of graphs and data tables. And for our cross-cutting concept, these are the ways scientists think about the different core ideas. So we can look for patterns no matter what discipline we're looking at, or we can look at the structure and function of different disciplines. And so today we're going to look at the cause and eventually the effect. And the benefit of using a phenomenon-based 3D science instruction is it promotes student sense making. So instead of being a sage on a stage where we're telling students, we are going to shift to being a guide on the side. And so we really want students to do the sense making. So tonight we're going to ask you to do the sense making, which is why in the email Alex sent out, she said you should have pencil and paper nearby because we probably will ask you to make a graph or two.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Kristen, did I cut you off?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, so take a moment, think back to Great Salt Lake, experiences that you've had there, memories that come to mind, ideas that come to mind. We're going to be exploring a phenomenon happening at Great Salt Lake today. And the phenomenon we're going to be exploring is that the water level of Great Salt Lake is changing. And even if you don't know anything about Great Salt Lake, that's okay. We're going to learn a lot today, but just so we're all on the same page, Great Salt Lake is a large terminal saltwater lake located in northern Utah. And what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the next 5 slides, and we're going to take about 15 to 30 seconds and make some observations about this phenomenon that we're going to be exploring today. So we would love for you to record your observations on a piece of paper, or you can type them in the chat. We will share and read aloud some of your observations about this phenomenon after we've looked at all 5 slides. So we're going to start with this slide here, which shows a top-down photo of our image of Great Salt Lake, a satellite image, changing over many years between 1984 and 2016. The water is bluish greenish and the land around it is brown and green. So take a moment and record some observations, some things you notice about how Great Salt Lake is changing over time. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one. Okay, so this slide again shows 3 top-down satellite photographs of Great Salt Lake in different years. What do you observe in this slide? How is Great Salt Lake's water level changing over time? What other changes do you notice? How is what you're noticing in this image different than the previous slide? On this slide, I'll point out that the water level of Great Salt Lake is listed as an elevation. For example, in the year 2000, Great Salt Lake is not 4,202.2 feet deep. The surface of the water level is at an elevation of 4,202.2 feet above sea level. And the average depth of Great Salt Lake is only about 15 feet deep, but surface elevation is how we've measured the Great Salt Lake's water level. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one. So this slide shows another satellite view of Great Salt Lake near Antelope Island in Davis County, and it's changing between 2011 and 2016. So what do you observe in this slide? How is Great Salt Lake changing over time? And how is what you're seeing the same or different than the previous slide? And hopefully you're writing things down. We're gonna make you type things in the chat. We're no strangers to having to wait for students to raise their hands. So we'd love for you to participate. Okay, and next, this slide shows a 2015 satellite image of the lake with a white line surrounding it. That line indicates the average water level of Great Salt Lake. So what can you observe in this slide about how Great Salt Lake's water level is changing? Maybe other things that you're noticing have changed. A pattern is a series that repeats itself over time. Can you observe any patterns in the changes of Great Salt Lake's water level? If so, what is the pattern that you observe? Okay, and finally, this is a graph showing Great Salt Lake's surface elevation since humans started recording it in 1847. It is important to point out that Great Salt Lake is currently at a historic low level of 4,190.5 feet. How is the water level of Great Salt Lake changing over time? What pattern do you observe in the changing water level? How does what you can observe from this graph compare to what you observed in the previous images? And we would love for you to share any of your observations in the chat. So Kristen, as hopefully some folks share their observations with us, we'll read some of what folks are sharing. But what have we noticed? What can we observe? What can we tell about how Great Salt Lake has changed over time, how its water levels have changed over time? Maybe other patterns you observed?
Katie, Janet says the lake is dynamic and the water level is always changing.
I love that. I think that's a great observation. I think looking back at this graph, we can definitely observe that pattern, that there are fluctuations in the lake's level. Did anybody notice maybe a trend in the changes that we saw? Decreasing, yep. So yeah, some observations maybe we could look for are that the water level of Great Salt Lake has overall decreased over time, right? We're at a historic low water level right now. Something else that I noticed in a lot of those images is that I see that in the chat, awesome. So I can see Evelyn shared when the water is lower, we see a lot more salt and sand, not vegetation, true. Someone else shared the water levels are decreasing. The surrounding area appears to be more dry compared to previous years. So great, that's what I was just about to say, is that when we look at some of these images that show the satellite imagery changing over time, so much of that lake bed is exposed. You can see what was underneath the water is now exposed, that sandy, salty, dry soil. Great observations. So remember that a phenomenon is something that we can observe that often makes us wonder. Now that we've observed that the water level of Great Salt Lake is declining, hopefully everyone observed that and can agree on that. What is something that you wonder about our phenomenon? Type your question, something you're wondering, into the chat, or record it on your piece of paper, something that you're wondering about this phenomenon we've observed. And as you think of questions, remember that developing questions, even making observations too, these are science and engineering process skills that take practice. And especially as we get older, sometimes it's hard to come up with questions. We see this with young kids, little kids all the time. Kindergartners have a million questions about everything. But then as students get older, we're kind of discouraged to ask questions sometimes, or we have fewer questions because we're worried about revealing how much we don't know, or that if we ask a question, it's like the wrong kind of question. And so it's important to remind all learners that there's no correct or incorrect questions. That this is an important skill that even as grownups, it's really good to just say, I wonder about this. I don't know the answer to that. How could I figure it out?
And we have a bunch of really good questions. We have, why is it decreasing? Is it more because of humans using up water, or less water coming in, or greater evaporation? I love it. We also have, has precipitation in surrounding watersheds decreased over time? We also have, how does the lake level affect migratory birds? And what are the lake inputs?
I love it. Those are all excellent questions. Thank you all for sharing. Those are great questioning skills demonstrated by all of you. The question that we're going to focus on and explore today is, what factors are causing the water level of Great Salt Lake to decrease? I think many of your questions kind of touched on that point, kind of stated simply, why is Great Salt Lake shrinking? So take another minute and quickly jot down some answers to these questions. What factors do you think could be causing the water level of Great Salt Lake to decline? Or why do you think Great Salt Lake is shrinking? What is your evidence for your reasoning? Or how do you know what you know? Or what's making you make that guess? Maybe you read an article in the newspaper about it, or maybe you are a research scientist, or maybe you spoke to an expert about this question. So what evidence do you have to support your guess or your idea? And finally, how could you go about investigating our guiding question? Could you do a Google search? Could you plan and carry out an investigation? And what information do you think you would need to answer this question? And again, our question is, what factors are causing the water level of Great Salt Lake to decrease? Or why is Great Salt Lake shrinking is kind of this more simple way to put it. Okay.
Okay, as you finish up writing, I'll let you know what we're going to do today. So to analyze and interpret data to construct an explanation about the cause of the changing water level of Great Salt Lake, we're going to create a graph of Utah's precipitation and maybe population data, depending on time. And then we're going to identify trends or patterns in Utah's precipitation and population data. Then we're going to explain the trends in Utah's precipitation and population data. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to construct an explanation about the cause of Great Salt Lake's decline. It's important to note as we're moving forward with this lesson that working with data is really hard, especially real data. Katie and I found it's hard to find the data that we're looking for. And so one way we overcame that hurdle was to contact organizations that have experts in the field, potentially like Friends of Great Salt Lake can find data. They turned out to be very good at it, Katie. UC was very helpful in finding data as well. And once we found the data we were looking for, not all the data was collected in the same way or over the same time frame. And so I don't know if you noticed with our phenomenon, we have different time ranges on those slides. And I think that the data that we're working with today, although it may be collected differently over different time periods, it's showing the same, hopefully you'll agree, patterns as we move through it. And finally, as a teacher, it's really time consuming to create a phenomenon-based 3-dimensional lesson with real data. This took a while to put together, and hopefully it's beneficial for you. I used this lesson with my 6th grade students earlier today, and it worked really well, and I was excited. And so hopefully it'll work well for you as well. And I'm excited to get started. Sound good? Okay, thanks, Katie. Okay, just so we're all on the same page to start, I want to just quickly go through our Great Salt Lake ecosystems water cycle, because it's important to know where we're getting the water if we're talking about water in Great Salt Lake. So typically water gets brought from the Pacific Ocean into Utah through the water cycle. And as the water vapor or condensation is moving across Utah, it continues to accumulate additional water vapor or condensation, and the clouds form. And as it gets colder, those water droplets begin to fall over our Wasatch Mountain, and the water runs off down the mountains and recollects in our Great Salt Lake. So thinking about how we're getting our water in Utah, how do you think the amount of precipitation we receive affects the Great Salt Lake water level? Take a minute and make a note on your sheet of paper you have, or feel free to type it in the chat. Be just another couple seconds. If anyone wants to share, I'd love to hear it or see it. Okay. Do you all agree? You can give me a thumbs up if you have your video on, that we would expect as precipitation increases, the water level of Great Salt Lake to increase. And as precipitation in Utah decreases, the water level in Great Salt Lake to decrease. Okay, awesome. Thanks for that feedback. Okay, so we're all on the same page with our water cycle. We get water in Utah, that's great. Now let's look at precipitation that we have received in Utah from 2011 to 2021. So when we look at the data table, the year is listed in the left column, and the average number of inches of precipitation Utah receives is listed in the right column. I will also point out, as we move through these slides, we've included the links where we got the data on each slide. So if you're interested in digging further into that, you'll be able to find that. Just looking at the average precipitation in Utah, do you notice any patterns in the data, in the numbers? Is the amount of precipitation increasing as the years increase? Is the amount of precipitation decreasing as the years increase? Is there no pattern at all? When I gave my students this data set today, they said they all noticed a pattern that precipitation increased and then decreased and increased and decreased as they looked at those numbers. And so then we're going to say sometimes the pattern's not obvious, and to help us see a pattern in data better, we can create a graph. So I would like you all to create a graph with this data. To do this, column graphs work really well with 6th graders. And so your graph needs to have an x-axis, it needs to have a y-axis, it needs to be labeled. And I would like you to graph 3 years. You can choose whatever 3 years you would like and graph oh, awesome, Katie, thanks. You can make a graph similar to what we have on the next slide and then choose 3 years. We'll switch back to that previous slide so you can choose your 3 years to graph.
This really makes me miss graph paper.
Yeah, we used it today in school. It was pretty amazing. We'll take just another minute. Okay, let's switch to the next slide. There we go. So this is a graph that Katie and I made, and we graphed the average precipitation from 2011, 2015, and 2019. When I look at this data, it looks like the pattern would be the precipitation decreases and then the precipitation increases. Looking at the graph you made, do you have a similar pattern or a different pattern? Or no pattern at all?
My pattern's different and my pattern decreases.
Interesting. Yep. Does anybody have a even? Ooh, your pattern also decreases, Jade, sorry. Yeah. And so one problem we can encounter when looking at small data sets is the patterns may not be clear. And so to look at a bigger data set, we might be able to see the patterns a little bit better. And this is the data set of precipitation in Utah in inches. So it's not average anymore, it's the observed inches between 1900 and 2020. When we look at this graph, do you observe any patterns in the data?
So Kristen, for me, that looks flat. It fluctuates, but the trend I would say was that it was flat,
Yes,
which I did not expect to see.
So I'm going to say this out loud, and I probably shouldn't, but I so badly expected the trend to be slightly down, like we're getting slightly less. And when I inputted all the data points into my Excel spreadsheet and ran the trend line, the R value was 0, no trend at all, positively or negatively. And so it looks like the water levels fluctuate, and they generally, or the precipitation we get every year fluctuates, but it generally remains between 20 and 10 inches of precipitation a year. Could you predict future precipitation, like next year's precipitation, based on this data set? My students said definitively no. They're like, we couldn't guess because it changes so much. And it does. It's constantly fluctuating and rather irregularly. Sorry, I didn't, the question in the chat. Yes, so Katie, I think, did you see the question in the chat? We talked about this in one of our planning meetings, right?
I think, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the answer to your specific question. Maybe we could look at these two slides, compare them again if we have time at the end. I would say overall, it goes back to different sources collect data in different ways. And sometimes it's hard to find like consistent date and timeframes and methodology, data collection methods. So I would love to look back at that again later on. Thank you for your question.
Okay. So we're seeing the amount of precipitation increases and decreases rather irregularly. If, I'm going to hold that thought and we'll go to the next slide. I want to take a look at a different data set now. And this shows the national precipitation rank. And so if we look at this map of the United States, the darker brown or reddish color are going to be the driest states, while the darker teal colors are going to be the wetter states. What patterns are you noticing when you look at the map of the United States here? Feel free to type one in the chat. Where are the dry states located versus the more wet states? Yeah, the West is drier for sure than the East. Now, if we take a look at Utah, we can see Utah is dark brown, indicating it is one of the driest states. Everyone show me on your fingers, what number driest state is Utah in the last 125 years? 1. We're the #1 driest state in the nation when you look at our precipitation in the last 125 years. So that's pretty significant. Okay. Now, if we think about precipitation and our Great Salt Lake water level, how do you think the precipitation is going to affect the Great Salt Lake water level? Again, do you think, I should say it this way, do you think it's the only factor that's causing the water level of Great Salt Lake to decrease? Or are there other things that are happening? Okay, we can take a look at our data on the next slide to see if the amount of precipitation that Utah receives was the only factor that caused the change in the water level of Great Salt Lake. We would expect to observe a similar graph in the Great Salt Lake elevation as we do in precipitation. So when we look at our trend line for precipitation in Utah, it's relatively flat. But now if we look at our trend line for the Great Salt Lake elevation, what do you notice about the Great Salt Lake elevation trend?
So the lake level's dropping while the precipitation is staying pretty flat.
Yeah, so is the precipitation causing the change in the Great Salt Lake water level?
Does not appear to be.
Nope, it does not appear based on the data. And I was pretty surprised by that when we started looking at this. Okay, so if it wasn't the precipitation, there are other things, other factors in our Great Salt Lake ecosystem that potentially could be causing the water level to change. So let's take a look at our next slide, and we're going to look at Utah's population change. And we've included more. Oh, good question. We're doing that right now. We included more data than is necessary because you may not all be elementary school teachers like I am. But for the case of tonight, we are just going to look at the year and the total population of Utah. How many people are living in Utah? And those are the first two columns on the left. So just looking at the year and the total population, do you notice any patterns in the data? Okay, so as I look at this data, I see that as the years increase, the population of Utah increases. Do you all agree? Awesome. So if we had more time, we would make another graph of Utah's population change, and we would have them graph 3 points again and look for a pattern. And no matter what 3 points students choose, it will make a graph that looks like this. Where it will be increasing as the years increase. So we want to look at a larger data set to see if this is just a fluke or if it's an actual pattern. So if we look at the data of Utah's population from 1900 to 2020, we can see that it shows that same increasing pattern. Now, a really interesting note is Utah did not hit 1 million people until 1966. So how has the rate of population growth changed since before 1966 and after 1966? Has the rate of growth increased? Has it decreased or remained the same? Yeah, significant recent growth. So it's increasing. And if you, yep, it has sped up recently. And we can tell from the slope of the line, right? So if we, if we were to predict what future population growth in Utah would look like, what would you predict our population growth line to be? Would it continue to climb? Would it level off? Based on this data set, what do you think would happen? Continue to climb. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so now if we've looked at our small data set, we've looked at our large data set, and now let's compare it to our national population change. And if we look at this graph, states with the highest rate of population change are a dark teal color. States with the least amount of population growth are tan. Those tan states are where the population is decreasing instead of increasing. So looking at our map and looking at Utah again, is Utah increasing or decreasing in population growth? And then is it increasing a lot or increasing a little compared to the rest of the nation? Yeah, it's increasing a lot. So it lists the percent change on the state of Utah, and it's listed at 18.4% growth in the last 10 years between 2010 and 2020. If you compare it to all of the other states, do you see any other numbers that are as high? Nope. So as of the 2020 census, Utah is the fastest growing population in the nation. So how do you think having this growth of population affects the water level of Great Salt Lake? Take a minute and write on your paper or pop an answer in the chat. Yeah, people use a lot of resources, for sure. Okay, so if we take a look at our next slide, if population is affecting the water level of Great Salt Lake, we should see some kind of relationship between the data. So if we look at the population, we can see it's increasing. And if we look at the lake level, we can see that it's decreasing. And this is because people are using more water. So let's take a quick look at where we're using water. Oh, before we do that, let's take a look about how the water is getting down to the lake. So watershed is land where all the water that falls in it drains to a common point. And this is our Great Salt Lake watershed. And if we look at our Great Salt Lake watershed, we can see on the west side of our watershed, it's fairly dry and not a lot of water is making it into Great Salt Lake. If we take a look at the east side of our watershed, we get quite a bit more water on the east side, and quite a bit of that water is making it down into Great Salt Lake. But as we look at this watershed map, I noticed that between the top of the watershed and Great Salt Lake, there is Salt Lake City, in Layton, in Provo, in Ogden, in Logan. And so between where the water starts and where it ends in the watershed, there is a lot of people. So people are using the water potentially before it can reach Great Salt Lake. So let's take a look at how we're using our water. So when we look at the average per capita use of water in our houses, in Utah cities, we average about 245 gallons of water per day per person. And my sixth graders were astounded by this number today. They were like, wait, what? That's a lot of milk jugs. And then when we compare it to other cities in the West, in other cities that are dry, we see that we use quite a bit more water than they do. Okay, we'll switch to the next slide. And how we're using, I agree, Oof is right. How we are using the water is 84% of the water we use in Utah is going to be used for agriculture. And a majority of this water is going to be used to grow crops to feed animals for us to eat. Some of that water, some of the water we use is going to be used industrially, and about 8% of the total water we use is going to be used in our houses. Now, when we look at that water we use in our houses, about 72% of that water is used outdoors. And outdoors includes our lawns and our golf courses and our fields. And so the majority of water we're using in Utah is for agriculture and for green grass. Okay. Now, if we look at how we looked at our littler picture of Utah, and now we're going to look at our bigger comparison. If we look at how the nation uses water, the dark blue states are states that use the most water. The light yellow states are states that use the least water. And do you notice any patterns in this map about where states that use the most water are located compared to where states that use the least water are located? So in the West, we use more water. Yeah, thanks, Jade. In the West, we use more water than they do in the East. And this map also lists the percent population change that occurred during this time frame from 2000 to 2015. So the population of Utah in this time increased at 33% over those 15 years. If we're looking at our map of Utah, are there any other states that use as much water as Utah does? From this map, it looks like there's one, Idaho. Yep, perfect. And when I did a Google search, we use more water per person per capita than Idaho. So we are the greatest consumer of water in the nation in Utah. And we are the #1 driest state in the nation. And we are the fastest growing state in the nation. But at the time this data was collected, there was a state that was growing faster than Utah. Does anyone see what it is? Nevada, perfect. So Nevada was growing faster at that time, and they were using less water than we were, not growing as quickly. Okay. Awesome. So to summarize that, Utah uses most water per day per person in the nation. And most of the water we consume is on farms, ranches, and our lawns. So if we go back to our guiding question, what factors are causing the water levels of Great Salt Lake to decrease? Take a minute and try to answer that based on the data that we've just engaged with. Yes, I love it. Evelyn had population. Jade just wrote population growth, agriculture, and green lawns are the factors that are causing water levels of Great Salt Lake to decrease. Evelyn noted that it's agriculture in a desert, so we're incorporating that dry environment as well. I think looking at this data is pretty powerful for students to really construct their own explanation of what's happening. And so if we move on to our next slide, we're going to just bring it back to the phenomenon again. The water of Great Salt Lake is changing. Do you feel like you could explain, or we'll do thumbs up or thumbs down for this. Do you feel like you can explain why Great Salt Lake may be decreasing or maybe increasing at this point? Okay. Do you think there could be other factors affecting the water level of Great Salt Lake that we didn't touch on tonight? Does anyone have any idea what other factors could be affecting the water level of Great Salt Lake? Okay. Ooh, warmer temperatures. Yep, increasing temperatures could lead to more evaporation, increased evaporation. I love it. My 6th grade students all noted our climate is changing. It was universal across the 50 students that I had today. And we didn't even get to touch on that at all with this lesson. So I think there are a lot of places you could go with this. And my last question for you is, does a declining lake level matter at all? What do you think? Yes, I think it matters as well. We'll turn the time back over to Katie, and maybe she can walk us through. We determined the cause. Now she can walk us through the effects.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for leading us through that. And thank you to everyone for your participation. And as a note, we are giving this information to you all as adults and as decision makers, but it's up to you if this side of the story is something you provide to your students. Learning about environmental problems can be overwhelming, and it's important to adapt this information to suit your students' age and grade level, just like it is with any of the data that you would be having them analyze. But what does all of this mean for Great Salt Lake? As we've seen, population growth and water use, maybe drought and climate change have all been factors causing Great Salt Lake's water levels to decline, and that decline has some consequences. The biggest threat to all of us humans living around Great Salt Lake, which is about 2.5 million people living along the Wasatch Front, is dust from the exposed lake bed. So more than half of the lake bed is currently exposed, and that dusty soil contains toxins, some naturally occurring like arsenic, and some unnatural that have been dumped in the lake over time and accumulated there, including mercury. And those are things that can become airborne with some of the sediment in dust when we have wind that flows across the lake bed. And those are things that can cause serious human health consequences. So we do not want that dust in our air. And of course, declining lake levels are also putting immense pressure on the lake's ecosystem. There are 5 to 10 million migratory birds that visit Great Salt Lake every year. And as it shrinks, that leaves them with less of the habitat and the resources that they depend on. So this is a hemispherically significant ecosystem for migratory birds across the whole Western Hemisphere. And, the list goes on and on, as I'm sure you can imagine, of all of the effects that this has for the ecosystem. And it's in all of our interest to avoid, or at least to minimize, these negative effects by getting more water to the lake. I see someone noted in the chat, can this dust also affect the snowpack by causing it to melt more quickly? Yes. So more so than the lake effect snow resulting in precipitation from evaporation from the lake. That's a relatively small quantity of our snow that can be traced back to evaporation directly from the lake, but the dust settling on top of our snowpack lowers what's called albedo, which is the reflectivity of the snow, and causes it to absorb more sunlight and melt more quickly, which affects our groundwater replenishment in the spring and runoff. And it has kind of a ripple effect on our water cycle in the area. Absolutely. If you're interested in learning more about this side of the story, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has this really great report about the consequences and economic costs of the declining lake levels. But we'll go back to some of the underlying driving factors that play into this imbalance in our water consumption versus our water supply. As we've discussed here, our state is experiencing pressures on both the supply and demand sides of our water resources, and yet our water consumption habits remain mostly unchanged. We're consuming the most water per person in the country. So why is that? And why have we not modernized our water usage to be resilient as we experience both growth and now face drought? And it comes down to some systemic structural issues. Utah water law and market incentive structures drive very high water consumption compared to neighboring states. We have what's called beneficial use water policy, which creates a use it or lose it culture, especially among agricultural users. So basically, if you hold water consumption rights for your property, if you don't use your full water right, you risk losing part of your right to that water. So there's no incentive for agricultural users to conserve their water. Great Salt Lake does not have its own water right. and it's not considered a beneficial use. So all of the water that makes it to Great Salt Lake is technically wasted under our current laws. And in terms of municipal water use, which includes residential and commercial use in homes and in our cities, Utah water prices are some of the lowest in the country. And this is largely because water district revenues are subsidized by our property taxes. They are not funded only by our water rates. So this also is connected to the fact that most water districts in Utah do not even meter secondary or outdoor water use. So our municipal and residential users can use as much water outside as they want and pay a flat rate. So again, there's no incentive to conserve. So this is kind of a lot that is stacked against water conservation, but these are all these structural barriers are things that can be changed, which is kind of the cool, encouraging part. These are all things that local and state leaders and we as community members have the ability to change and restructure in a way that works for us and our ecosystems. So what can we do? Again, learning about issues like this can be really scary and frustrating and overwhelming, but it's so important to focus on empowering students and empowering ourselves to be a part of the solution. And there are always things that we can do to move in the right direction. For Great Salt Lake, this means conserving water as an individual. And this is really important as kind of being part of changing the culture around water use, especially our outdoor water use, doing things like, letting your lawn go yellow in the summer or considering xeriscaping or local scaping. That is a shift that we really just need to make. We're overdue in making. Consider eating less meat. As Kristen mentioned, so much, 80% of our water that we're consuming is used for agriculture. That's mostly to grow crops like alfalfa that are fed to animals for people to consume. So that's kind of a big opportunity to reduce your water footprint. And there's a link in here to calculate your water use and just consider how you might be able to personally reduce your water consumption. Another important thing that we can do, especially as adults and decision makers, is be an advocate for the lake, advocate for changes to our water policy and consumption. Do things like write to your elected leaders, the governor, your state representatives, your local leaders to express your concern. Participate in local planning decisions, or you can also get involved with Friends of Great Salt Lake. If you're feeling interested in getting more involved, you can become a member. You can sign up for our advocacy alerts. That's going to be really important during the state legislative session. And it's also important to connect with our ecosystems, connect with Great Salt Lake. If you are a Great Salt Lake lover, bring some other people out there with you to experience it. I really think when you're out there, it speaks for itself so much. And it's a beautiful landscape that is worthy of our attention and protection. So we've covered a lot of ground here. I think it's very likely that many of you will have more questions that came up after this. There's lots of opportunities and resources you can look to continue investigating some of those new questions that might come up. These are a few examples. And analyzing data is not the only way to gather evidence. There are other sources of information that you can use to help draw conclusions and gather evidence as well. And we really appreciate all of your time and participation today. This is a really important topic, and I think it's going to become even more important as Great Salt Lake continues to drop to new historic lows. So we appreciate you considering bringing this important issue into your classrooms to help your students better understand their role and connection with this ecosystem. And again, these slides and some additional resources from this lesson are posted on our website. I will put this link in the chat here. And if you have any questions, you can contact me and I can forward any questions to Kristen. This is my contact information on this slide. We would love to connect with you on Instagram and Facebook. And again, if you're interested in getting more involved with our mission to preserve and protect Great Salt Lake, we would love for you to consider becoming a Friends of Great Salt Lake member too, and just stay in the loop with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. We'll be sure that this video will also get uploaded onto our YouTube. And once again, just thank you and Katie and Kristen, and you all have a nice night. Thank you.
Just want to say thanks. That was awesome.